Hello and welcome to the Calm Waves podcast. I'm your host, Dallas Cowan. And today I have Nate Waugh, as he's known in Montreal, but I know him as Nate Roy. He's a friend of the podcast. This is his second time here. He's one of the guys that I really respect in the neuro space because he is in it. He is the guy who is just building papers and doing research and doing a bunch of the awesome work to bring kind of neuroscience to the world. And so he was telling me about this little background of this podcast. He was telling me about a research project he's doing. And so Nate, I would love for you to share just what you're working on and just the project you just did with the mice.
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Dallas, for the introduction. I've been very excited for this conversation because I always find these topics, our discussions here, so insightful and so enjoyable. So, yeah, I'm a PhD student in neuroscience currently, but I have a long-term interest in bridging neuroscience research into the context of psychiatric medicine, specifically for adolescent psychiatry. So, the project that I'm working on here for my PhD at McGill concerns adversity in adolescence and the effects that this has on the development of the brain in the longer term. So basically how the brain develops between adolescence and adulthood and how this might be affected by adverse experiences. And within this realm, I'm particularly interested in the development of the dopamine system because, well, I could talk for 2 hours about why the dopamine system, but in short, we know that the development of the dopamine system is very much implicated in the onset and severity of psychiatric illnesses that may emerge in adolescence or potentially in early adulthood. And on top of this, even in the context of normative development, where we might be free of disorders, the dopamine system is heavily involved in our daily lives in terms of motivation and the reward system and behaviors such as impulsivity and these things that are largely implicated in our long-term outcomes. So going somewhat full circle, I am interested in adversity, but I'm interested in a more positive tilt here, where I want to know what experiences or what stimuli can we potentially add in to the adolescent time interval as a means of perhaps protecting or reducing some of the longer term harmful consequences of adversity on the development of the dopamine system.
So because we can always say that stress is bad, anxiety is bad, those are adverse type of situations. So you're going, okay, those are adverse things, but what does it look like to add positive things in? Is that what the kind of the study is on?
Yeah, exactly that. So the brain's development is largely dictated by basically the set of all inputs that we take in from our experiences and our environments. And to some degree, it might be a negative statement, but adversity is going to be there. You mentioned stress. Stress is part of the path, but I'm interested in, what else might we be able to add to the path as a means of steering that overall set of inputs to be something that's favorable for the development of the brain as opposed to something that might be damaging.
So, a question I have, in your opinion, this might be a longer conversation. This might be a harder question to answer. Nature versus nurture is a big thing of going. Is it your environment that causes things? And I know it's both. I know there's a both type of thing. Or are you programmed in to be like this? So what it sounds like is, you're taking it as adolescence. I think when we talked about before, it's 13. 13 was kind of the age. So when we talk about adolescence, we're talking about, 13-year-old middle schooler. I asked all my middle schoolers that I teach at church, how old are you? And so, and I got the numbers of it. But yeah, so it's that middle school age. So you're going, all right, in this age, this is a very important time to develop, and
Absolutely.
the dopamine system. And we talked a little bit about your research project, and so you worked with mice. I would call him every once in a while and be like, "I'm in the basement with the mice."
Way too often in the basement with the mice.
So tell me more about that, of kind of the little bit of the way that you did this, because I think it's really interesting of how you spent your time doing it.
Yeah, for sure. So my project works in parallel with human data and with mice. We have a large longitudinal cohort with a lot of different behavioral measures, and it contains information about environment and outcomes for this large cohort of humans. But at the same time, though we would like to be able to do all our research in that context to answer questions in a way that's most generalizable to the context where we're interested, in order to answer the how of this question, how might adversity affect development of the dopamine system? And further, how might these more positive stimuli protect the development of the dopamine system? That is something that rodent research provides a lot of utility for, because we can, for example, dissect their brain tissue that was extracted at different time points in their life as a means of looking at like the routing of the dopamine axons and the presence of different gene markers and proteins and all these things. Basically, big picture, we answer the questions on a surface level with the human data. Basically, what stimuli might be protective, what might adversity be doing. But then we can take this, it's almost like we're going in with a magnifying glass with the mice and saying, okay, well, how is this actually happening in the brain? And that's, to me, I mean, that's why I'm in the basement all those long hours with the mice, is as unenjoyable as it might be at times. I'm driven by the fact that if we can understand why the brain is traveling along the trajectory that it is in response to the experiences that we take in, we can modulate that, whether it's through some intervention that we're adding in, or if it's pharmacologically. I mean, there's all kinds of, we've talked a lot about neuromodulation techniques as well. That's what I'm most interested in, is uncover the mechanism and then find a means of going in and moderating that.
It's amazing. So going back to the question that I actually didn't ask, when you were seeing like the nature versus nurture standpoint, did this bring up any of those types of, did it answer any of those questions? Because I mean, it's one or the other. Kind of not one or the other, but people will say, well, it's your environment that you're in. That's what kind of like programs you, or it's the way you're born. You're just built like this. So what did this type of finding kind of make?
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating question, and I wish I had a more complete answer. But thus far, as you could imagine, I think the answer is somewhat in the middle, wherein we know that an experience such as social adversity is doing something to alter the trajectory of the brain's development. But we also know that we basically come into the world with certain neurobiological presets. And what this manifests as is there's almost subsets across the population. And here I'm talking in particular about mice, but what we've seen in mice, it leads us to believe that this is the same in the human world, and there's research to back that up as well. But in the context of the mice, we've seen this, where there's different behavioral phenotypes, which is just basically different behavioral patterns that we see that allow us to put the mice in these subgroups, and different subgroups respond differently to the same experience. So if we have group 1 and group 2, just to give them simple names, they're seeing the same experience, but group 1's trajectory is pushed over here, whereas group 2's trajectory is pushed over here. And I think that's, again, this is more the head in the clouds view of all of this, where it could lead. I think that's very interesting as well, because if we can uncover which behavioral phenotypes are, for example, most susceptible to a negative experience, this provides a lens through which we can guide early interventions or things like that might protect this population. And at the same time, on the positive side, if we can identify behavioral subgroups, phenotypes that are are more likely to benefit from a certain potentially protective intervention. Well, now we know the target group to which we might administer these sorts of things. So that's something that I'm going to continue to work on. It's kind of further downstream in the project, but I'd like to be able to identify based on behavioral predictors or perhaps even genetic predictors which mice, and then ultimately in the human world, which people might be most benefited by certain positive interventions, and at the same time which groups of mice and again ultimately people might be most susceptible in the context of different sources of environmental adversity.
What's a phenotype?
So a phenotype is the expression of a gene. You know, we talk a lot about genetics, but the phenotype is what we see. So it's like a behavioral manifestation of a certain underlying genetic pattern that a mouse or, like I said, a human might have. So to give a concrete example, because I too often, I think, venture into just talking as if I'm in a science room, but, you know, the goal here is clearly to get the information to the public. So with that, in the mice, one of the things that we do in my lab is we separate them into what we call resilient and susceptible phenotypes. And this is something that we find out via a test of social behavior following social adversity. So basically, we have our social adversity model that we run the mice through, and then as almost like a post-test, we place these mice in a box, one by one, where on one side of the box, behind bars, is one of these larger mice that looks just like the mice from the social adversity model that were aggressive toward it. So it's almost like they see the bully over there in the corner. To be very particular here, the mouse that's placed behind bars, there's not one of the same exact ones, but it's one of that species, of the species that was aggressive toward it during the stress period. And basically what we want to see is this experimental mouse that we place in the box, is it going to go up and interact despite the fact that it just went through this socially adverse experience? And we find that there's two distinct subsets. You know, all the mice went through this stressful experience. Almost seem like they didn't. They just go up and interact anyway. And others, it's very clear that they're in this stressed state. They'll hide in the corner. They'll do anything but go up and interact. And so that is what that second category is our susceptible phenotype. And that first category that goes up almost appearing unaffected, we call the resilient phenotype. And very interesting, in kind of the general population, we'd be like, well, yeah, resilience is awesome. We're all trying to build resilience, and we've gotten mixed results across male and female mice and other things, but we do have some amount of evidence, particularly in a study that we conducted on female mice, that it's actually the resilient mice, so the ones that almost seem unaffected in the short term, those are the mice that are in the long term more affected. So they're resilient in the short term, but associated with this is the fact that the trajectory of the development of their dopamine system is more altered. So in adulthood, we test their cognition, their impulsivity. We look at the routing of their dopamine axons, and we see that those resilient mice seem to be a lot more affected than the mice that were susceptible, socially susceptible, we would say, in the short term, which is fascinating to me. It almost appears that there's some amount of neurobiological trade-off in order to maintain social behavior in the short term. It's almost a cost to this. And it's something we need to continue to study for certain, but that's a glimpse, I suppose, not meaning to talk to people's ear off on the mouse studies, but that's a glimpse of what these behavioral phenotypes may be able to tell us.
I mean, that's such an interesting thing, because people always talk about that in sports. Like, you have resilience, you need to have, like, that's a positive word. But what you're saying is you're studying it, and you're saying that when you say long-term effects down the road, what would that be equivalent to of saying, I know you can't, prove it right now, but what are your findings leaning towards down the road? So if you have somebody who's like, hey, social behavior is like, yeah, I don't want to be around the bully. I don't want to do that. What is their trajectory versus somebody who's like the resilience? Hey, I'll come back in. I'll come back and do this. Like, what does that look like down the road?
Yeah, so I think that's a fascinating question and something that I want to most definitely gather more information on. And as a quick disclaimer, as you said, it's tough to extend the behavior of mice into the human world. But just
Mm-hmm.
as one potential interpretation that I've thought a lot about is the resilience in this context is almost to me could be a refusal of truly taking in the environment. So, we talk about when we have an adverse experience, do you let it affect you? Do you really think on it? Do you feel it? Do you perhaps talk to people about it? Or do you maintain eyes of steel and then deflect it and act like it never happened? And again, this is somewhat of maybe a leap that I maybe shouldn't be making, but this is where my mind is at, is in the human world and in clinical psychology, we know that there's positive effects associated with letting yourself really sit in the adverse situation. And I'm not saying we should all, hang out with our bullies,
Mm-hmm.
but, in context of grief, of anxiety, even of disappointment, there's a lot of work out there that's showing that, and even the interventions sometimes that are administered, it all involves, not all of it, but can involve sitting with these things and allowing ourselves to feel them to a greater degree. And that's how I almost see this susceptibility, is a willingness to be affected by what just happened as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to deflecting it. And with this, perhaps there's some amount of, like I said, a neurobiological trade off where, yes, we can hold frame, we can deflect it, we can go about business as usual, but that may require resources that are being taken away from processes that are supporting adaptive development. And I think you had asked about what this might look like, if we are resilient in the short term and perhaps see negative effects in the long term. Well, in the mice in particular, that study I was referencing with the female mice, we see that the dopamine system doesn't develop properly. And we see that associated with that, we have this impulsive behavior
Mm-hmm.
in adulthood. And we know that in the human world that both of those things are traits that are heavily implicated in mental health conditions. So that's the implication, and it's something we need to flesh out. We most definitely need to continue the translational work, bridging from animal research into clinical context with humans, but we have people boots on the ground doing this. And I think that's very exciting as we will continue to form this bridge and ultimately be able to inform the care that we administer in the clinical environment, and perhaps even the things such as educational interventions that exist within schools and out there in the real world.
Well, it's so fascinating that you say that because I think when in my experience, you've got kind of the older generation. People talk about the older generation, never show your emotions. Like you just gotta, put up the upper lip or, whatever that looks like. And so now, people are saying it's okay to do your emotions. It's okay to, show, when you're sad, feel your feelings. I remember when I was at the group home working with foster kids, I was in a in a place where I had a 12-year-old making me mad. And it's like, I can't do this. I can't show that, this 12-year-old's making me mad, 13-year-old's making me mad by poking at me. I went to therapy, kind of processing through it. He talked about how it's like it's okay to be angry. It's okay to have these, feel your feelings. And because if you don't feel your feelings, if you don't feel your anger, you're not gonna feel your joy. That was kind of like the thing about it was, both of those types of things. But yeah, I think there's total benefit in sitting with your feelings. I'm feeling sad right now. Okay, you feel sad. Like you need to that this event made me this way or whatever it is. So I think it's really interesting that you're seeing that in the development of the brain, because we're seeing it as the output of the mental side of it, or the soft side of it, or the non-tangible side of it, the emotions
Right.
coming out of it. But you're looking at it and going, oh no, we can see it physically happening in the brain. We can see that these things aren't being wired together correctly. And then this is the long-term effect of that. So, what I see about this is just the proactive approach to teaching kids how to express their emotions and how to express their things, and not just be like, no, you can't do that. You can't, I mean, do it in the right way, in the right guardrails. But, that's very interesting of people who are more susceptible to, I mean, impulse control is going to be anybody, as you say, in the mental health world, who, rehab centers and all those types of things. That's your classic impulse control. They don't have it, or
Right.
they're lower on it than other people. So that is super fascinating. About what would you? So going back to, I know we talked about the age range, and what is it about 13 that you saw in your research?
Yeah, so looking then at the human data, which is kind of where I stand now. For once, I'm not in the basement with the mice for the next few weeks.
You
Now I'm
graduated.
crunching
You graduated
numbers
out of that.
for now. But yeah, now crunching numbers on the human side, because ultimately that's the goal, is to go back and forth between what do we see, how is it happening? What do we see, how is it happening? And so now I'm looking at the again, the effect of adversity that takes place in adolescence on cognitive outcomes in adulthood. And to start off there, we do see this very negative relationship where you can picture a negatively sloping line where the more you're exposed to bullying, particularly here, we're looking at like age 12 and a half is when the bullying scale was taken. But the more exposure to bullying, the worse the cognitive outcome in adulthood. And we measure this cognitive outcome via impulsivity.
What's the definition of bullying? What would be your definition of it?
Well, in this particular study, it's coming from a scale that's called the Bullying and Friendship Interview Schedule. And it's a series of items that basically say, I think it's 11 things, and they ask, how frequently is this happening? And it will be like someone took your belongings without asking, or someone called you a rude name, and they were answered as seldom occurring, something in the middle, and then the highest score is like frequently occurring. And so it's these different dimensions along which they all play a role in what we would call social adversity or bullying. And then what we have done in this project is taken these different dimensions and used them to create a bullying score, which basically shows how much someone is being exposed to social adversity overall in this time period of development.
Are these questions are asked? Have you heard? Are these going to be like people close to them? Is that what a bullying, or just like general population people? Is it like school? Is it like family members? Is it like how close are the people that you're at? Or is it just kind of like a general question?
Yeah, more general. I mean, that's actually a sticking point in research with some of these scales is there's always room for interpretation. So one person might be reading it as close family members and friends. Other people might be reading it as everyone. But in general, this scale in particular is asking about just their general environment. So it's everyone they're seeing. It could be someone they just happened to cross paths with, or it could be a sibling or something like that. But ultimately, I think both matter. If you have a bully in your immediate presence, someone in your class at school or something like that, you're going to end up answering frequently to a lot of these. And therefore, you'll have this higher score, which represents that higher concentration of social adversity that you're seeing in that situation.
Are you familiar with the ACEs score? Adverse
I'm
Childhood
not.
Development Score? Okay.
I am not.
Okay. It sounds familiar to kind of like when you take the scale, it's ACEs is Adverse Childhood Experience. That's what it is. And
Interesting.
so it's you fill it out of like were your parents divorced, these kind of like trauma type of things. And
I
once you
see.
fill it out, if you have a score above like a certain amount, you're more susceptible to like alcohol, drugs, and things like that.
I
So
see.
it sounds like the same type of scoring type of system, but on a bullying side of things. So
Interesting. Yeah, I'm gonna have to add that to the list to
yeah.
take a look at, because that's what I'm trying to do right now, is to become more informed on all the different ways to measure these things so that I
Mm-hmm.
can more optimally build this model. As I was saying with the outcome, I mean, here's another example of how I'm trying to basically yielded more information out of this same question. Is we've already shown, like I said, this negative sloping line where being exposed to more bullying means worse cognitive, or is associated with worse cognitive outcomes in adulthood. But next, I want to look at neuroimaging data in adulthood. So yes, the cognitive scores show an effect. But what I want to see is, do we have, for example, different activation patterns or different activation synchrony between the prefrontal cortex and reward centers in the brain, because that is something that tends to underlie lower impulsivity scores. But if we can show it mechanistically, show this association, that just, I think, provides yet another window into how we might be able to modulate this relationship.
So we talk about bullying. So that's a social constraint. So that was the main thing that you looked at was in that social kind of environment. Here's the adverse thing, and the mice reacted kind of different ways. And then you're doing like that 12 and a half. 12 and a half is where you said, hey, this is where it starts.
Right.
Asking these questions. Where did that take you? Keep going down that road of the 12 and a half and the bullying side of things.
Yeah, so that first insight was crucial to show that yes, bullying does have this effect on long-term cognition, because that shows, this is something we need to take a look at. It's very important. And secondly, then what this directed me to do was to look at what information we had outside of this in terms of what experiences this human cohort was having throughout adolescence. So one thing that I'm very interested in is how physical activity might modify the development of the brain. So we have data via accelerometers that show how much participants in this cohort were moving across their adolescent time window. And I added this into the model to ask the question, does activity, physical activity, buffer or blunt this observed relationship between bullying and cognition in adulthood? And this is very preliminary right now, but what we're seeing is yes, it appears that it does. So again, if you're picturing this negative sloping line, it's almost like for higher activity individuals, it's less negative sloped.
Mm.
Now, yes, social adversity might have some negative effect, but it's significantly less. I mean, there's so many questions that branched
Mm-hmm.
off from here. I want to know, how can we optimize this? If we place the activity in a certain point of the circadian window, for example, or is it certain intensity intervals that might be most important? Then this leads me back to the mice, right? I'm like, how? How does exercise buffer this? So as we speak, I have mice in a box running on wheels as a means to assess how might this affect the development of the
Mm.
brain. And if we can figure this out, again, this is the head in the clouds view, but if we can isolate that mechanism, this is something we might be able to modulate outside of the context of physical activity. So I think the obvious response from anyone, and I would not blame anyone for saying this, is like, well, yeah, we know physical activity is good for us, right? We have known this for a long time. And yet a lot of people don't do it because it requires a certain amount of motivation and other kind of psychosocial assets that we may not have at a given point. But if we understand the mechanism, we can recreate this by other means. And so to me, this is in the long term is a way we can isolate the pathways that underlie a positive effect that we already know to be the case and find a way to do this outside of the context of physical activity.
Well, it makes sense of like people always talk about how sports are so good for kids and being on a sports team and, running and doing all that stuff, being on a soccer team and doing that. So, it's so good for the kids and they're going to learn about how to deal with adversity and, the mean kid on the team or whatever it is. But it just adds that other layer to it to say, it's actually not about the sport, whatever it is. It's about the activity, the physical activity that they're doing along with it as well. So I think that's just an interesting thing to see those kind of things. I mean, correlate in the real world. Like, why is it that this kid who was on the sports team, who was bullied, was able to get through it? Was it because he was on a sports team, or is it because he was doing physical activity? Like I think they're correlation types of things, or was it an identity thing? Because it'd be like identity wasn't in the people; it had something to have an identity in. Like there's a lot of those types of things as well. Because it's a layered approach. But what you're seeing is like this is what I'm taking from this is a very important time in
For
life
certain.
to be very cognizant of that person, whoever it is, who's that 12-year-old, 12 and a half-year-old, 13-year-old, of going, oh, we need to really take care of these kids during that time, no matter what, kids all the time, but in the development of the brain process, to be able to go, oh, this is an important thing if because it's going to have more long-term effects.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. And what you said about this being a very sensitive time, this is something that's really gaining traction right now in neurodevelopmental research. And we, for a long time, have called the early life period, meaning like the very beginning of life, the critical period for neurobiological development, because the brain is so plastic. It's taking in experiences and rapidly remodeling in response to these experiences. But as I was saying, lately, more recently, there's a growing population of neuroscientists who are calling this adolescent time window a second critical period, where it's almost like the brain's sensitivity to the environment is super high. We're very young. And then it does go downhill where the brain becomes a little bit less plastic. But we see almost a new surge of plasticity during adolescence, particularly, what we've been talking about, which is the dopamine system. And given that that's a system that's so crucial for health and long-term outcomes, this is, I think, critically important that we not only paint the picture of exactly what's going on here, but then find a way to create environments for adolescents that's going to be supportive of the trajectory of the development of the brain in the best way possible so that we can steer these long-term outcomes.
So what would you say? So I'm thinking right now, I've got a 6-year-old right now. And like I'm as a parent, I don't want to helicopter parent him and be like, I don't want you to have any sort of adversity. I don't want to have you to have any sort of, but it's that resilience. I want to build resilience in them, but I don't want to do it in a bad way. So what does the research show? And I know you're not a parent, but like, what would you show or what would you say to someone who has a 12 and a half year old or something like that? Like, what would you say based off of this research? Be like, hey, this is some advice some insight based off of what I found.
Yeah, I think, and this is not necessarily my research, this is more what I've explored outside of the lens of my project. But we've talked a little bit about stress here. And ultimately, bullying, social adversity, this is a form of stress. And this has been documented across literature on humans as well as mice. We look at basically the cortisol response as well as genes associated with the stress axis. This is just stress. And it leads you to ask, well, stress, that's also when you're going to the gym, right? You're putting yourself under stress. So I think something that is very interesting to consider and to perhaps explore further is stress appraisal. When we're in a stressful situation, we're being bullied, we are very uncertain about a choice to make, whatever might be causing stress in our day. How are we taking in this context and relating it to the bigger picture of who we are as people, as you mentioned identity earlier, and also relating it to our overall path and context for life? So that's what I'm very interested in, is how can we take seemingly negative stressors and move them into that positive category? And I don't think, I'm definitely no authority to speak on the mechanisms that underlie this, but we know this, that stress can be very positive and stress can be very negative. And that's in some ways what my project is looking at. And it's counterintuitive, right? Because it's like we're seeing stress in the form of social adversity, and we're trying to protect from this by adding another stress inducing experience, which is exercise. And yet we see that there might be an interesting result here. So I think finding a way to go back to the original question, in the context of parenting, or whether it's teaching or coaching, a way to guide adolescents to be able to take in their environment and appraise it in a way that ties it to their identity and to their long-term path in a positive way. I think that's a super valuable tool, because we can try to steer the environment all we want. And as you said, I'm definitely not a parent, but I know this is something parents are often very concerned about, is what environments their kids are in. But to some extent, those environments will always have these stressors. But how can we equip the kids to be able to take these stressors and, as you said, remain resilient to them? And I think that a lot of that is in how we're perceiving these things. And, I know you do a lot of work with this, with the tools such as reflection and journaling and all of these things, visualization. And I think all of those tools have a place in making us more resilient to our environment through this sort of stress appraisal process.
So good. Love it. I love this conversation. I think it's an important one to have. I think if you're a parent or if you are working with kids or anything like that, I think it's so important to have, like, how am I communicating with them? Am I joking with them? Or am I able to be a positive influence on their life? I think that's such a big thing. Well, thank you for this time. I got to take off here in just a little bit, but I love this, and I would love to continue this conversation, because I think another conversation I'd love to have with you is contextualizing stresses, because I think that's such an important thing that we don't do. Because I think of, like, play pickleball, that's a stress. But then I also have work, that's a stress, and then it's like, all these stressful environments. So I think it's like, how do you contextualize that, in our own lives as adults, but also in kids as well, and the impacts that they have. So, but thank you so much for your time. I know we could probably talk
Yeah,
another
thank you.
hour about this.
Yeah, we'll have to schedule about 6 more episodes. I
I
have
know.
thoughts on what you just said as well. So
No, we're gonna do this. We'll off the air. We'll talk about, doing a cadence of doing some talks on this, because I think
amazing.
it's such an important conversation to have. And you have a perspective that I think needs to be shared more based off of
Thank
the
you.
research. So I think it's amazing. But thank you for your time,
Yeah,
and
thank you.
we'll do this again. This will be a part one. This will be a part one of a conversation, and we'll just keep
Amazing.
going with it.
Sounds
So,
like a plan.
all right, thank you so much.
Thank you.